about our founders. On the Great Seal of the United States, it says, Novo Ordo Seclorum, a new order for the ages. They had so much confidence in what they were doing that they said it was going to last forever.
In the previous video, I discussed how the CCP virus might have kick-started the digital currency and the mark of the beast. In this video, I'm going to discuss how it has kick-started the
New World Order.
Before I do that, however, I would like to post up here remote jobs that are currently hurting as a result of the pandemic scare. These stay-at-home jobs are the following: customer service representatives, data entry specialists, online tutors and teachers, content writers, remote sales consultants, 401k referral agents, life insurance agents, licensed home inspectors. I have saved a list of these jobs in the description, so feel free to conduct a search on ZipRecruiter or Indeed for these related jobs. And I wish you the best of luck. If you prefer first responder work, feel free to click the subscribe button and the notification bell to not only receive the latest updates on jobs in demand, but also end-of-the-world news and predictions. So you're probably wondering why I'm hiding my face. Well, this is because I'm looking all over the place when reading this teleprompter right here in this part of the screen. I put together this teleprompter to sound less like Joe Biden and more like his podcast. So I do sincerely apologize for the get-up and for being a completely not real person. Now, for those of you who are new to the concept of the New World Order, I'm going to mesh together these clips to help you understand what this means and which entities are interested.
Let me say this about our founders. On the Great Seal of the United States, it says, Novo Ordo Seclorum, a new order for the ages. They had so much confidence in what they were doing that they said it was going to last forever.
A new world order. A world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
The affirmative task we have now is to actually create a new world order, because the global order is changing again. And the institutions and rules that worked so well in the post-World War II era for decades, they need to be strengthened, and some have to be changed. So we have to do what we do best. We have to lead. We have to lead. We have to update the global rules of the road. We have to do it in a way that maximizes benefits for everyone, because obviously it's overwhelmingly in our interest. This is not a zero-sum game. It's overwhelmingly in our interest that China prosper, that Mongolia prosper, that nations big and large, east and west. We have to level the playing field so that American companies and workers can compete in the world, that the competition is fair and it's healthy. To the first point, we came into office facing the worst financial recession since the Great Depression. We had to unfreeze the credit markets, reform the financial system, inject demand back into the economy. And while this agenda is far from complete, we've made significant progress with all of your help. The economy is now added private sector jobs every month, disappointing this month, but they nonetheless added jobs. Even so, we've still found that there's a need for an ambitious affirmative agenda.
You do it. My thoughts are, because it's not written into law, it's just a very dominant culture. I think the only way you can do it is a couple ways. One, I'm thinking about an executive order from day one that says, in more legalese than this is not a thing. We will no longer honor this, because the way that automatic prerogative works is there's got to be compliance with the executive branch, because otherwise it doesn't work. So you got to eliminate that compliance, and you make it a mandate, and then you do training particularly in the city, I'll call them licensing departments, whether it's zoning, buildings, housing will be impacted by it, planning certainly, and you pick the people to run those agencies and the deputies that are pledging allegiance to the new world order and good governance, and then I think you have the Inspector General do some spot audits to make sure that there is real compliance.
These are the members of NATO, a military alliance formed in 1949 to protect European countries against the Soviet Union.
Only a strong defensive alliance could deter them from further adventures.
NATO now includes 29 countries, including 3 that are former Soviet states.
Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania.
The Soviet Union may have collapsed, but Russia is still trying to wield influence over the region and undermine nations who get in its way. How? By trying to destabilize America and Europe and damage their relationship. The goal? To weaken alliances so Russia can more freely pursue its interests. From cyber meddling to mind games, here's how the country and its leader, Vladimir Putin, excel at geostrategic trolling. One tactic: frozen conflicts. The method: invade a foreign nation, reject the outcry, and hold the territory. Exhibit A. Just as Ukraine was embarking on a pro-Western course and possibly joining NATO, Russian-backed rebels seized Crimea. They've been there ever since. And Russia even built a massive bridge to connect to the area. Plausible deniability. Method: stoke instability, claim innocence. Exhibit A. Little green men. Russia claimed the insignia-free forces who took over strategic locations in Crimea were not the Russian military, but instead were, quote, separatists. Putin eventually admitted that the men were his troops, once Crimea was under control. Intimidation. Method: posture the military in provocative ways. Exhibit A. Deploying next-generation nuclear-capable missiles at NATO's doorstep. Cyber meddling. Method: undermine elections, trigger power outages, Ukraine leak emails. Exhibit A. Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear. These were Russia-linked hacking entities accused of attacking America's elections. The U.S. has indicted 12 Russian military officials for the interference. Use soft power to hide ugly truths. Method: host international sporting events to show you're a good global citizen. Exhibit A, the World Cup, which allows Russia to gloss over charges of human rights abuses and international isolation. Woo world leaders. Method: find a useful megaphone for your message. Exhibit A, Donald Trump. The U.S. president has been reluctant to criticize Putin for his country's actions.
And I might even end up having a good relationship, but they're going, President Putin is KGB, and you know what? Putin's fine.
That's made it easier for Russia to achieve its aim of weakening the world order.
China wants to lead a new world order, and they're using the United Nations to grab power. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. The United Nations. According to its website, the UN has one central mission: the maintenance of international peace and security. Well, I certainly like peace and security, don't you? And certainly it appears we've avoided another world war. And that's because the UN is supposed to be a place where all the countries around the world can work together for the benefit of everyone. But over the years, the Chinese Communist Party has been getting more and more influence over the UN, and that's already had serious consequences for the rest of the world. Joining me today is Anders Kor. He's the publisher of the Journal of Political Risk and principal at Core Analytics. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
So first of all, let's talk about the latest controversy. China now has an influential position in the United Nations Human Rights Council. How did the Chinese Communist Party get in the UN body meant to monitor freedom of speech, arbitrary detention, and enforce disappearances? Is it because they're so good at those things?
Well, no, they're one of the worst at those things. They're well known as one of the world's worst human rights violators, yet they've used their influence in the UN to get that position. They trade votes, they badger people, they bribe people. It's typical carrot and stick tactics to achieve those kinds of positions for these autocratic countries.
Well, so what kind of impact might China have on the UN Human Rights Council?
Well, they're going to have a bad impact. I mean, it's exactly counter to the human rights. So, it's a big problem that they've joined. They're now already cutting down speech when if you have a human rights activist or a nonprofit organization come to speak at the Human Rights Council, they will typically try to shorten the amount of speaking time that they have. They'll try to keep people out, like they kept Dolkan Issa, who's a famous Uyghur activist and representative of the World Uyghur Congress. So they'll use every dirty trick in the book to keep human rights out of the Human Rights Council.
That's incredible. How can that be tolerated?
Well, a lot of countries, the UN is essentially run by the elites, the political elites of each country, the political leadership of each country, and political leaderships of each country are typically closely linked to the economic elites of each country. And those economic elites, of course, are making money often in China. And if they're not making money in China, then China can offer them to make money and use that leverage to influence the political elites, then to get votes to get China onto the council and other things. I mean, it's not just the council. There are many other organizations, UN organizations that China has joined. The Aviation Organization, the Industrial Development Organization, even they tried to get onto intellectual property, which was another crazy attempt and totally counterintuitive. But they can do it because they get the votes, because they have the money.
So this isn't isolated to just any one particular UN body. This is throughout the UN.
It's throughout the UN. China can get the UN votes in the General Assembly, and that's how they vote to get people onto these committees. So they're quite influential. For example, when one country, Austria, wanted to, didn't want to vote with the UN on a particular thing or statement, and they were threatened to not be able to have their embassy in Beijing. They were trying to get land for their embassy in Beijing, and China threatened not to give them that land unless they refused to sign a particular statement in favor of the Uyghurs. And Montenegro and other countries have also received similar treatment.
So really this isn't as simple as just China saying, hey, human rights, I don't think that's not a good idea. Like, that would be too obvious. But they're really just kind of subverting the entire institution.
That's exactly right. And a lot of countries aren't very favorable to human rights either. All the authoritarian countries or quasi-authoritarian countries would just as soon keep the UN and their human rights mandate, which dates to 1948. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights has, mandates that the UN support human rights, language rights, electoral rights, essentially democracy. Yet the UN is increasingly, not doing that now that China has so much influence. Russia, North Korea, and China recently co-sponsored a UN General Assembly vote on internet sovereignty, which basically was a cover and a legitimization of their censorship of the internet, and they got that vote through the General Assembly. So they have a lot of clout. They're able to get onto a lot of positions. They have They have clout on UNESCO, and that's how politics works in the UN and the international system. UN votes are for sale.
Now you said China, Russia, and North Korea?
Correct.
North Korea?
Yes.
Well, so, I mean, yeah, like you say, when I think of the UN, I think of, it being dedicated to peace and human rights. Why is the free world allowing regimes like the Chinese Communist Party or Russia or North Korea to completely subvert the main mission of the United Nations?
It goes back to the League of Nations, which was founded in 1920, and the United Nations, when it was founded in 1945. The idea was to include the big dictatorships in the organization, to try to engage them, to try to socialize them, civilize them, if you will, into being democracies over time. And they signed up to that in the early documents of the Atlantic Charter. They signed up to some of these principles: freedom of the seas, democracy, human rights. And so they indicated that they would make improvements on that, but they basically went back on their word. And over time, it's been very clear with the Soviet Union and now especially with China that these guys have no intention to democratize. In fact, just the opposite. They want to make us into authoritarian countries. They want to take our international organizations and turn them into a tool for their own use.
Is that what China's goal is?
Absolutely. They want to use the UN to promote their own global hegemony, essentially.
So what would that look like?
It would look very bad. We would see increasing loss of freedom of speech, increasing loss of democratization. If you look at the Philippines right now, it has gone through a process. It is going through a process of lack of, losing some freedoms. The press is under attack in the Philippines. The Philippines has switched alliance from the United States to China, or is sort of in the process of doing that. A lot of countries are switching their alliance with Taiwan, or recognition of Taiwan, to recognition of Beijing as the paramount power in China. And you would see countries, if China really was able to increase its influence substantially over the next 10, 20, 30 years, you might see some countries come under enough control from Beijing that they would lose rights, like the Hong Kong people are losing rights, or like the Uyghurs have lost their rights, 1 to 3 million in concentration camps there. So we don't want to go down that road. We want to make sure that China doesn't get the influence at the UN or get influence in our countries, in our capitals. And the same process can happen in Washington, D.C. or Paris or London, where businessmen that are doing business in China are used by China as levers to try to influence national level politics in our democracies.
So it's basically like a numbers game. It doesn't matter if the United States, the UK, France, and Germany are opposed to China turning the UN into something that opposes freedom of speech, for instance, as long as China gets enough other countries to back what it wants.
Yeah, I mean, there are some limitations, like the UN Security Council. The US, France, and the UK all have veto power on the UN Security Council. So there are some technical limitations, but those limitations can be overcome in time if China, as China gets more influence and is willing to break rules that the UN has, and they've proven themselves willing to break rules all over the place. So yes, all of that can be washed away if China achieves the influence that it is trying to do, and it's in the process of that. So we really have to wake up to this problem and remove any ability of China to influence our national politics or the politics at the UN.
Well, let's talk about China's Belt and Road Initiative, an infrastructure project that's been called colonialism with Chinese characteristics. China's gotten it officially recognized as part of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. How?
Well, they're trying to shoehorn their Belt and Road Initiative into the SDGs, by trying to make linkages, claim linkages. But in reality, what's going on is that it has nothing to do with the SDGs. The Belt and Road Initiative is, primarily to offload economic excesses that China has, whether that's they have excess infrastructure, building capacity, so they offload it to countries. In the meantime, they loan the money to buy those infrastructure projects from China. They loan out that money. So now China has something like $5 trillion of lent out money in the world. It owns $5 trillion of debt from other countries, a lot of which has gone to fund Belt and Road projects. So the money actually never leaves China. It goes from one bank account in China to another bank account in China. And a country like Sri Lanka is left holding billions of dollars of debt and maybe a port that's useless. For example, their Hambantota port. And it's so useless that it can't pay back the loans as was originally thought or was originally sold to them. And so what they have to do is, in that case, they had to lease that port back to China for 99 years. They have to pay up their collateral, and often the collateral is the project that China's been working on. And oh, by the way, that project is primarily useful for getting extracted resources from that country back to China. So it's less about actually developing things in that country that country needs in the future. For example, independent industry or independent technology companies. It's more about turning these countries that accept Belt and Road assistance into mercantile sort of satrap nations that have to then depend on resource exports or agricultural exports. This is exactly what China sees itself in the world. It wants to see itself as the industrial and technological global hub of the world, with all other countries feeding it natural resources and feeding it agriculture, and then getting back in return finished goods that China itself manufactures. And that way, China is always on top economically, China is always on top technologically and industrially. And when that's the case, all other countries essentially lose not only economic influence and sovereignty, but they lose military influence and sovereignty, because if you don't have an industrial base, if you don't have a technological base, your military is worthless.
Yeah, it really sounds like it aligns with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. So,
right.
I think a lot of people are beginning to realize China's power in the UN thanks to the World Health Organization. So the Chinese regime has gotten it to praise China's coronavirus response, shut out Taiwan, and attack critics of the party. Now, the US was the largest donor to the WHO. China only counted for a fraction of a percent of the budget. So clearly, China isn't just buying influence. How is it getting the WHO to do its bidding?
Well, Dr. Tedros came on in 2017. When he put his name forward as a candidate to become the head of WHO, China supported him. Ethiopia had already had billions of dollars of Chinese investment in the country. So already China had a lever on Dr. Tedros. Then Dr. Tedros comes through and he starts supporting the Belt and Road Initiative back in 2017 when he first got in. And he was supporting what's known as the Silk Road, the Health Silk Road, or something like that, which China is now pushing after COVID-19. So he has had levers on him, and the question is, in many people's minds, what is he? Is he personally getting something out of this, or is he just responding to his leadership back in Ethiopia, who's putting leverage on it? There are cases where a UN official, the president of the UN General Assembly, John Ash, was caught being bribed by a Chinese company. This is a $1 million bribe, and the bribe was to get him to put in a UN convention center in Macau, which is owned by China. So when he was caught, he, of course, was put under FBI control. He basically was in court, and the FBI was on him, and he was, I think, going to give information on the Chinese in court, and he mysteriously died under a barbell in his apartment, and that to me is quite suspicious. So you see the kind of carrot and stick approach encapsulated in poor President John Ash of the UN General Assembly, who initially took the carrots. When he got caught, he got the stick in a big way.
Yeah, he was like, I heard like a 60-year-old man at that point, and like the day before this big trial, he was found, well, they first thought he died of a heart attack, then they ruled that his throat was crushed by a barbell. It's a little strange. Don't
Yeah,
you think?
likely story.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, the source of China's power really comes from, as you mentioned, it being on the UN Security Council. A lot of people might not know this, but the People's Republic of China wasn't always in that position. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how China found itself, the Chinese Communist Party found itself in that position?
Well, back in the 50s, the UN was actually in a war with North Korea and with China in order to protect South Korea from prior North Korean invasion. And in the 1960s, the U.S. was going through the Vietnam War. We were having a hard time, and Nixon and Kissinger, by the end of that, in the early 70s, were deciding that the Vietnamese guerrillas were being funded in part and supplied and helped by the Chinese and the Russians, and so the Kissinger and Nixon decided that it might help to engage with China and try to turn China against Russia. At least that's the official story. So they in 1971 and 1972, they engaged and they opened up to China. Then over the next few years, that decade in the 70s, they let China into the UN, and they essentially got Taiwan kicked out. And it's a very sad situation in a way, because Taiwan was a U.S. ally at the time. They weren't a democracy, but they were a U.S. ally. And then in the 80s and early 90s, Taiwan democratized. So if we had actually kept Taiwan in the UN rather than let in China, and then after we let China into the UN, we let them into the World Trade Organization, which gave them trading access to the whole world. It legitimated them, and all of a sudden, China went from being a pariah nation to being a global player. And then, in 1989, they briefly had the situation with the Tiananmen Square, where they killed thousands of civilian democracy protesters. And so there was a very, very brief moment, where they were again a pariah state, but that only lasted maybe a few months or a year or something. And then all the world leaders wanted to start doing business with them again. And then in the 90s and 2000s, the business started increasing. Their military expenditures started rapidly increasing. We should have known at that point that it was a very bad idea to continue engaging China. We were only empowering them to do bad things, and they were clearly bad actors because they had killed their own democracy protesters. And then in 2008, when we had the financial crash in the U.S., China really sensed blood, and they started thinking they were on top of the world. So between 2008 and now, they've now started really grabbing territory, Scarborough Shoal, other places. I mean, they'd already done it in 95. They grabbed Mischief Reef in the South China Sea. But this just continued, and their power increased and their influence increased. They start funding U.S. universities, European universities, giving them huge donations. They start bringing U.S. military guys to China to do boondoggles and trips, and supposedly under the training, to do training. And even congressmen they bring back to China to supposedly do training. Professors, they bring them back. So their influence just increased massively. And then they started giving all these sweetheart deals to some of our biggest billionaires, whether it's Schwartzman or Bloomberg or any number of guys. And the guys who are on the outside, like Facebook for a while, those guys want to get in because it's a huge market. It's a quarter of the world's economy or something like that. And they all want into that market. And so they're willing to do a lot, including, I would argue, represent China and essentially lobby for China with the highest levels of U.S. government. And so and this isn't just happening in the U.S. This is happening all over the world. When Prime Minister David Cameron left office from in the UK, he went and he started lobbying for China, promoting the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's a real problem. And Kevin Rudd of Australia, former Prime Minister of Australia, also very pandering to China publicly in his speech. And his daughter makes a lot of money in China. So you have a real problem of economic linkages between Western democratized political elites and Chinese business. And that is what is causing the lack of a response, the lack of a defense to China as it expands its territory and influence.
So it's not just the UN.
It's not just the UN. We got it right in D.C.
Well, all right, so time for some moral equivalency. What's the difference between how the U.S. uses the UN to push its agenda and China's?
Well, I think the U.S., because it's a democracy, has always promoted democracy and human rights around the world. There are cases when the U.S. Will ally with another country that's not a democracy or do things that are not really consistent with human rights. But I would argue that those are almost always in support of a long-term goal of democracy, whether that is fighting the Vietnamese in Vietnam or fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan or going to war with Iraq. Iraq had just invaded Kuwait and might have been building nuclear weapons. So there's always been a higher democratic or human rights or stabilize the international system goal behind any transgressions that the United States might have caused. China, on the other hand, is grabbing territory from countries that are poorer than itself, like Vietnam and the Philippines. They're taking oil and gas from those countries. They're taking fishing rights from those countries. And so it's totally inconsistent with their stated goal of being even a communist country. They're not at all. They're not actually a communist country. It's a very aggressive capitalist country that's a dictatorship that's trying to become the next world emperor. Become the first world emperor, really.
Now, the conventional conspiracy wisdom seems to be that all these groups are working together to establish a new world order, that this dream has been admired long before the founding of America by the Freemasons and the Illuminati. I'm going to propose a different theory. Before I go any further, it is important to note that 4 things can be true at once. Number 1, the premise of the New World Order is inherently evil. Number 2, all these proposed entities are pursuing a New World Order. Number 3, all these entities oppose the viewpoints in such a radical way of each other regarding the New World Order. Number 4, the influence behind a New World Order is anti-Christian and anti-Semitic. Now, I think it is fair to say that conquering the world that fits your own viewpoint is inherently evil. Let us, however, assume this mindset. Your sole reasoning for this objective is to live in a world that either best suits you or to limit the amount of chaos in the world by establishing order. What kind of order should be established then? It would have to be an order that is capable of establishing a top-down structured rule in order to limit war and chaos. Establish absolute sovereignty. Your intent can either be good or bad. Plenty of people in this world have this mindset. However, since everyone is molded differently, because we're all human, everyone holds a different outlook in how the world should be run. Let's say I want to rule the world that runs on Judeo-Christian values. Someone out there will disagree with me in this matter. Some people prefer to keep religious values absent from politics, and others prefer an Islamic rule over the world. Eventually, because of our fallen human nature to destroy one another, we're bound to cause fractures in our relationships with one another. This is certainly true regarding other nations. Earlier, I played a clip from the New York Times saying that Putin is making an attempt to cause fractures within the New World Order. If you think that's a good thing, think again. Putin is human. He's not exempt from these rules. He holds this same unstable mindset of conquering the world in order to live in a world that best suits him. of course, don't take my word for it. Take it from CNBC. Putin seeking to create new world order with rogue states amid coronavirus crisis, report claims. Russian President Vladimir Putin and his administration are using the coronavirus to spread conspiracy theories in a bid to subvert the West and create a new world order, a new report has alleged. In an article published Wednesday by the University of Calgary's School of Public Policy, it's claimed Russia has been churning out propaganda that blames the West for creating the virus. The report's author, Sergei Sukhankin, said the state was propagating disinformation and conspiracy theories via social media accounts, fake news outlets, state-controlled media, pseudoscientists, and Russians living in the West. The Kremlin had previously denied such claims. Putin's larger goal is spreading propaganda and conspiracy theories is to subvert the West, Sukhankin said. Russia seeks to seriously damage the solidarity among EU members and capitalize on any internal European weakness to promote border conflicts. The CCP virus is seen as an ideal way for Russia to deal a powerful blow not only to the EU, but to inflict damage on the ties between Europe and its North American allies. Moscow also wanted revenge on the West for economic sanctions that were imposed on Russia for various reasons, including its annexation of Crimea, Sukhankin added, warning that the Kremlin saw an opportunity amid the crisis to unravel the current world order. Moscow views the virus as a fortuitous harbinger of the end of the post-Cold War liberal world order, the report said. The new leaders to emerge from this liberal collapse, according to this view, will be Russia and China. Indeed, Russia is seeking to strengthen its ties with China, as well as with Iran, and the danger is that other rogue states could join this new configuration. Speaking to CNBC on Tuesday, Qiu Jin, associate professor of economics at the London School of Economics, also claimed that China saw the coronavirus crisis as the, quote, opportunity of the century to establish a new role for itself on the international stage. On Wednesday, an updated report from the EU's foreign policy arm, the European External Action Service, claimed countries including Russia and China were spreading disinformation about the coronavirus. The EU reported more than 150 cases of pro-Kremlin disinformation on the CCP virus between the end of January and the end of March, the report said. Now, although I think it is important to address the concept of the New World Order, I don't necessarily think it is going to be established in the end times. In previous videos, I've mentioned that there was going to be a future war between two regimes spoken of through the prophet Daniel. This war entails the hostility of entities between that of the Antichrist and a regime south of Israel, most likely in Africa. Throughout this particular chapter, we find a description of a future war between two regimes, one north while the other south of Israel.
Here is what I say to these two kings.
Eventually, Daniel provides the description of the third king of the north.
And now the dragons are dead. There sits the only king I mean to bend my knee to. The king of the north!
The former king will be succeeded by a contemptible person who has not been given the honor of royalty. He will seize the kingdom through intrigue, as well as desecrating the temple fortress, abolishing the daily sacrifice, and then setting up the abomination that causes desolation. What is even more disturbing is this quote from Daniel. The king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. Doesn't this sound familiar? After looking at the four different entities, here is what we have. Paul mentions the man of lawlessness. John mentions the beast and the false prophet. Daniel mentions the beast with 10 horns, as well as the king of the north. Seeing as how these entities are all one and the same, it would now be appropriate to merge these entities, these respective entities, under the same name, Antichrist. So this comes back to our main question. Who is the Antichrist? Who? Well, it would appear that the Antichrist happens to be the third to step up to the plate regarding the king of the north. I also mentioned that the regime of the Antichrist was going to arrive out of either Lebanon, Turkey, or Russia. So where will the Antichrist come from? In the previous videos, I provided the entity of who and what the Antichrist was going to be. Some of the scripture used to describe the Antichrist is in the book of Daniel, with the Antichrist pinned as
the king of the north.
So the Antichrist should be coming from the north. Well, north of what? Well, whenever the Bible says north, south, east, or west, the point of reference is going to be Israel. So what is north of Israel? Well, if you look at the globe and go directly north of Israel, we have 3 suspects as to who the king of the north is going to be so far. These 3 suspects are Lebanon, Turkey, and Russia. Spoiler alert, I think it's Russia. Here's the good news for those of you who are watching this from Russia. Vladimir Putin is not the Antichrist. It's not biblically accurate to deem him the Antichrist when he hasn't fulfilled this part of Scripture in the book of Daniel. I made mention of how the Antichrist was going to rise to power in the end times, and Putin hasn't done this. How will the Antichrist conduct itself? Well, according to the cross-references from the previous videos, it would appear that the Antichrist will behave in a deceitful manner, as stated in Daniel chapter 11, verse 21, regarding the rise of the Antichrist.
The king of the north
will be succeeded by a contemptible person, who has not been given the honor of royalty. He will invade the kingdom when its people feel secure, and he will seize it through intrigue. Putin held an approval rating of 70% before 2015, when he was up for re-election. Now, it is important to take into consideration that there have been some rumors spreading around stating that Putin would interfere with Russia's nationwide regional elections. Well, recently, his approval rating has been declining because of the CCP virus pandemic scare. I don't know why he would want to fabricate those numbers. It's rather self-defeating. Now, if you want further cold hard evidence that Putin is not the Antichrist, you needn't look any further than the preceding verses of Daniel regarding the second king of the north. This verse states that the Antichrist's predecessor is to be, quote, destroyed, yet not in anger or in battle. This sounds a lot like an assassination. I'm not God, but I don't think Putin's predecessor was assassinated. So where does the importance of the New World Order come into play if there is going to be a future war against the regime of the Antichrist? Earlier, I, along with the book of Daniel, made the prediction that the regime of the Antichrist and the King of the South would both hold evil intent. This means other countries would too be against them. At the beginning of this chapter, Daniel describes how this future war initiates. The king of the south will become strong, but one of his commanders will become even stronger than he and will rule his own kingdom with great power. After some years, they will become allies. The daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to make an alliance, but she will not retain her power, and he and his power will not last. In those days, she will be betrayed, together with her royal escort and her father, and the one who supported her. One from her family line will arise to take her place. He will attack the forces of the king of the north and enter his fortress. He will fight against them and be victorious. He will also seize their gods, their metal images, and their valuable articles of silver and gold, and carry them off to Egypt. For some years, he will leave the king of the north alone. Then the king of the north will invade the realm of the king of the south, but will retreat to his own country. His sons will prepare for war and assemble a great army. which will sweep on like an irresistible flood and carry the battle as far as his fortress. Then the king of the south will march out in a rage and fight against the king of the north, who will raise a large army, but it will be defeated. So where do other nations battle against the king of the north or the regime of the Antichrist? We have this occur in Daniel chapter 11, verses 18 through 19. Then the king of the north will turn his attention to the coastlands and will take many of them, but a commander will put an end to his insolence and will turn his insolence back on him. After this, he will turn back toward the fortresses of his own country, but will stumble and fall, to be seen no more. Who are these coastlands? It's possible they might be the European Union or NATO. Do these coastlands hold good or bad intent? We'll save that later on in this video. In this passage, we find that even Israel stands in opposition against the king of the south. In those times, many will rise against the king of the south. Those who are violent among your own people will rebel in fulfillment of the vision, but without success. I've even mentioned in a previous video that Israel will stand in opposition against the regime of the Antichrist. So what is the Antichrist? Paul describes him as the man of lawlessness and a man doomed to destruction. So, we already know the Antichrist is going to be a man.
Excuse me, it's ma'am. It is ma'am.
In the book of Daniel, he is described as a king, someone who will seize the kingdom through intrigue. He will also act deceitfully, and with only a few people, he will rise to power. Plato referred to these type of people as demagogues. Plato expressed concern for these type of characters in democracy societies. Daniel also points out that this particular king has anger issues throughout his reign.
And I will not be bullied by that.
Plus, since the beast out of the earth is to be the same respectful entity, the king of the north also forces all of his people to receive a mark on their foreheads or their right hands as a means of controlling the economy. He also executes anyone who refused to worship the image.
Kneel before me. I said.
On top of this, he's also going to be the one to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. So not even the Jews are going to be on his side. Even earlier in the same passage, it states that the heart of the king of the north will be set against the holy covenant. So based off this description, it sounds like the Antichrist is actually going to be a conquering dictator similar to that of Stalin, Hitler, or Mao Zedong. So to answer your question, what is the Antichrist? It would appear to be the final despot in history. You know, similar to Armageddon, the final battle in history. So, as it appears, there is no herald of hell, no supernatural Antichrist figure that is going to rebuild the Jewish temple, so please, all of you that wish to promote these unfounded theories...
Sit down, Chaim.
Okay, cease, period. So, what does this have to do with the CCP virus? Get to the point already. Before the CCP virus, China was the world's leading creditor and lender. China, however, dropped the ball with its reputation of the CCP virus. China knows this, and most importantly, the world knows it.
China is saving the world from the coronavirus, at least according to China. But does the world believe them? Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. This episode has been sponsored by Surfshark, because you should be using a reliable VPN whenever you go online. So, As the coronavirus outbreak continues around the world, the important thing to remember is that it's been China all along who's leading the battle against the pandemic. Why? What did you think I was going to say? As Chinese state-run media tells us, China has been at the forefront of the global fight against the COVID-19 outbreak, sharing its experiences, expertise, and donating supplies and equipment to countries around the world. Yes, China has been both donating and selling medical supplies and equipment to the rest of the world, and the rest of the world has been extremely grateful. How can you argue with the spontaneous gratitude shown by officials from Fiji and Mexico? The president of Poland was so grateful, he even personally called Chinese leader Xi Jinping. And who could forget what the president of Serbia did? Now that is some enthusiastic gratitude. Yes, the Chinese Communist Party seemed poised to turn the whole, whoops, we covered up a deadly disease outbreak and unleashed a global pandemic that's killing people and destroying economies around the world, to actually, we're the ones who saved everyone by buying the world time with our responsible stance. And we're leading the battle against the pandemic. Yes, the Chinese Communist Party's attempt to claim global leadership using the power of face masks almost worked. And then they went too far. Reports are now coming out about how those donations came with some strings attached. In fact, Beijing demanded praise in exchange for medical supplies. Often, Chinese officials tell counterparts abroad that they must publicly thank China in return for the shipments. Take the case of that phone call from the Polish president. According to the U.S. ambassador to Poland, Poland would not get the medical supplies unless the president made the phone call. So if the Chinese regime was saying, you better thank us if you want these face masks, suddenly this makes a lot more sense. Never mind, that's still going way too far. I mean, they can force you to lick their boots, but you don't have to tell them it tastes good. But the Chinese regime isn't just looking for praise for giving other countries face masks. Chinese diplomats have also been pressuring other countries to praise them for their coronavirus response just in general. For example, Chinese diplomats approached German government officials in an attempt to encourage them to make positive statements on how Beijing is handling the coronavirus pandemic. The Chinese consulate even reached out to a Wisconsin state senator asking for praise. Okay, now that's starting to look a little bit desperate. By the way, we interviewed Senator Roth about how the Chinese consulate contacted him, as well as his memorable response. Check it out on our podcast, China Unscripted. So, the Chinese Communist Party isn't the friend who just comes over to help you out when you're in a tough spot. They're the friend who Instagrams a photo of themselves outside your door with flowers, then makes you thank them on camera so they can add you to their story. So how well is China's coronavirus propaganda working? Well, you can definitely see some of those propaganda messages making their way into mainstream media, like the idea that China bought the world time. But there also have been articles calling out China's propaganda, even from unlikely sources. There's also been more and more backlash from other countries, including many countries in Europe, and in the developing world as well. Now, the Chinese Communist Party is pushing their propaganda hard, partly because they, like most authoritarian governments, are control freaks. But they also legitimately fear a global backlash because of the coronavirus pandemic. In fact, an internal report presented to the party leadership shows that global anti-China sentiment is at its highest since the 1989 Tiananmen Square crackdown. Ironically, it seems that the party's own heavy-handed response to that fear is leading to further global backlash. We'll have to see where it goes from here.
Since China has expressed its desire to take the lead in the New World Order, I highly doubt other countries are going to allow for that to happen. Regardless of how much debt they hold with China or how far their Belt and Road Initiative extends throughout the world. Likewise, I doubt China will neglect calling back debt owed to it. Of course, other countries are likely to refuse to pay this debt since they may consider the damages done to them were due to the outbreak of the CCP virus. I certainly expect this to happen to the African countries.
China is killing Africa with debt and colonizing it country by country. This is China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Have you ever borrowed money, say, for school or a shipping port, but struggled to pay it back? And then your lender, was like, okay, no problem. Just give me the rights to everything you earn for the next 99 years. I think we can all relate. And so can a lot of countries who've borrowed money from China. It's called debt trap diplomacy. Just ask Sri Lanka, a small island nation off the coast of India. In 2010, they got a small $1.5 billion Chinese loan to build a giant shipping port in the town of Hambantota. But there wasn't much shipping traffic, which meant not much cash flow. Sri Lanka missed a few payments, and next thing you know, they had to sign away the entire port to China with a 99-year lease. But it's not always easy to learn from others' mistakes. In Africa, dozens of countries have taken out Chinese loans. And last September, China pledged to invest another $60 billion in Africa.
China and Africa will join hands to build a China-Africa community with shared future that features win-win cooperation, happiness for all, and harmonious coexistence.
Of course, Xi Jinping's definition of win-win is that if the country can pay off the loan, China wins. If they can't, China takes over its assets instead, and China still wins. So, win-win. So, which African countries are most at risk of, shall we say, getting Sri Lanka'd? Well, here are the 5 African countries with the most debt to China.
I will leave a link to this video in the description box for you to conduct your own analysis regarding the King of the South.
Wait a minute. You said the King of the South? You think the King of the South is going to be...
Likewise, for the King of the South, if you go directly south of Israel, you will hit the northern African region. Yes, I do.
How?
The African countries are not going to want to pay off the debt in response to the CCP virus pandemic. Politico reports, coronavirus ends China's honeymoon in Africa. Africa was supposed to be China's new stomping grounds. Instead, the novel coronavirus has spawned a growing backlash that threatens to unwind the ties Beijing has carefully cultivated over decades. The trigger of the burgeoning diplomatic crisis, anger over the treatment of African citizens living in China, and frustration at Beijing's position on granting debt relief to fight against the outbreak. China has spent untold billions in Africa since its emergence as a global power, investing in its natural resources, underwriting massive infrastructure projects, and wooing its leaders. The campaign has bought China friends and allies in multilateral institutions such as the United Nations and the World Health Organization, undermining the West's once reliable lock on the post-war world order while fueling its economy back home. But that decades-long quest for influence in Africa was gravely challenged last week when a group of disgruntled African ambassadors in Beijing wrote to Foreign Affairs Minister Wang Yi to complain that citizens from Togo, Nigeria, and Benin living in Guangzhou, southern China, were evicted from their homes and made to undergo obligatory testing for COVID-19. In some cases, the men were pulled out of their families and quarantined in hotels alone, the note, seen by Politico, said. The incident, which caused widespread discontent both within Africa and among the diaspora after videos posted on social media showed people of African descent being evicted from their homes, resulting in a rare diplomatic showdown between Chinese and African officials. It also broke a long-standing tradition of Africa voicing its problems with China, the continent's biggest trade partner, behind closed doors. In one incident, Nigeria's Speaker of the House of Representatives, Femi, I'm not even going to pronounce that, posted a video of himself summoning Chinese Ambassador Xiao Pingjian to his office, where he expressed his displeasure about a Nigerian man being evicted from his home. While nobody expects China to lose its place as Africa's biggest bilateral lender and trade partner, analysts and African diplomats say there is a distinct possibility of lasting damage. Reluctance from China to endorse a G20 decision to suspend Africa's debt payments until the end of the year has exacerbated the sense of frustration, they said. There was a lot of tension within the relationship. I think both of these issues are the newest manifestations of long-term problems, said Cobus van Staden, a senior researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs. Africa's official response to its citizens in China took into account popular sentiment a lot more than it usually would have. Some scholars have documented how politicians in Africa have boosted their electoral base by mobilizing anti-Chinese sentiment, while many ordinary people perceive China's success in the region as a threat to their own well-being. So Africa will more than likely break from China relations. Since the continent is highly unstable, they're going to need security. Who better to provide it than the motherland Russia? There is, however, one predicament. Russia, along with Iran, are teaming up with other rogue states to achieve their new world order. Let's say Russia decides to continue relations with Africa after this scare is over. Guess who's in debt to China? Guess who is pushing for the new world order with China? Guess who's been an ally to China? Guess which country's security force China technically owns in Africa? Guess what China does whenever a country can't pay off its debt like any lender would? What do you think China is gonna do when a country won't pay off its debt? Ta-da! Repossession!
No worries, keep it holstered. Everything's okay. I can pay. Sorry, that's not my department.
If you think I'm being radical in stating this, let me remind you. Citizens from Togo, Nigeria, and Benin temporarily living in the southern Chinese province were evicted from their homes and made to undergo obligatory testing for the CCP virus, which caused an uproar from Africa in the first place. Therefore, assuming that if Russia officially betrays Africa for the sake of avoiding the loss of its quote-unquote comprehensive strategic partner, that it will force Africa in a position to war not only against China, but Russia as well. So, with all these competing perspectives with how the world should be run, I highly doubt the New World Order will be established in the end times. And I certainly doubt that all the entities I've mentioned are working together. Freemasonry and Illuminati be damned. As a matter of fact, I'm expecting this difference in perspectives on the New World Order to initiate World War III, now that I've mentioned the above triggers of the conflict. A little forewarning though, World War III, if it occurs, is going to be more vicious, more destructive, and more furious than any of the past wars. Why do I expect this? Aside from technological advances, here is a video regarding the butterfly effect that World War I caused and left behind.
As an historian, I'm often asked if I could stop one event in modern history from happening, what would it be? My answer is World War I. If there had been no World War I, there would have been no Russian Revolution, no World War II, no Holocaust, no Cold War. And that doesn't even consider the millions who died in the war itself. Following the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, Europe experienced an unprecedented period of economic growth. Brought about by the Industrial Revolution, this new prosperity spawned rapid developments in science, medicine, art, and political philosophy. The future of civilization never looked brighter. And then suddenly, it all went up in flames. The fuse was lit in June 1914 in a street in Sarajevo, Bosnia. It was there that Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. It should have been no more than a sad footnote in history. Instead, it changed history. Austria-Hungary, seeking to avenge the Archduke's murder, declared war on Serbia. But before taking this drastic step, it asked for and received a blessing from its powerful ally, Germany. Serbia, knowing that it had no chance against Austria-Hungary, called on its ally, Russia, to defend it. Russia agreed. To strengthen its hand, Russia solicited French support should war break out. France, ever suspicious of German intentions, assented. Germany then made a preemptive move to take France out of the war. The German command, having long planned this war, invaded France through neutral Belgium. This prompted Britain to join France against Germany. Suddenly, the entire continent was engulfed in war. The key player was Germany. Their strategy was to punch through Belgium and France and capture Paris before the French had time to react. This was the so-called Schlieffen Plan, named after the German general who conceived it. With France conquered, they would turn their attention to Russia. That Germany thought it would actually work comes down to one man, Germany's leader, Kaiser Wilhelm II. The Emperor of Germany from 1888 until his forced abdication in 1918, Wilhelm was a profoundly unpleasant, unstable, and vicious personality. By 1914, he believed that Germany should not only dominate Europe, but the entire world. Had the Schlieffen Plan worked, Germany most certainly would have. But it didn't work. The British and the French put up stiff resistance in the West. Russia did the same in the East. The losses incurred by all sides were immediate and appalling. The widespread use, for the first time, of barbed wire, machine guns, tanks, and worst of all, poison gas, turns the fields of France and the steppes of Russia into vast cemeteries. By 1917, the war was at a stalemate. Who knows how long it would have stayed that way if the United States had not been drawn in. Ironically, President Woodrow Wilson had been elected largely because he promised to keep America out of Europe's war. His attitude changed when Germany attacked American merchant ships in the Atlantic. The final straw was the infamous Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany promised to give Mexico, in exchange for its military support, much of the American Southwest, including Texas. The infusion of American manpower and weaponry allowed the Allies to take the initiative. The war finally ended in November of 1918. 16 million people, soldiers and civilians, were dead. 3 million Russians, 2.5 million Germans, 1.7 million French, 1 million British, and 117,000 Americans. Russia was now in the hands of Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks. France and Britain were physically and morally shattered. Germany, forced into a humiliating surrender treaty at Versailles, would soon be further decimated by runaway inflation that destroyed what was left of its economy. Meanwhile, the United States retreated into isolationism. It was a pause, not a peace. The stage was being set for a new and very much worse disaster, a Second World War, one that would lead to 3 times the deaths of the first one. It would be instigated by a madman who fought for the Kaiser and shared the same dream of world domination. Had it not been for World War I, we would never have heard of him.
Given the fact that World War II was 3 times as worse as the first one, we can expect World War III to hold much more drastic results. Given the fact that both world wars were fought over global domination, it is highly likely World War III will be fought for the same reasons. The incentive for China pushing for a new world order amidst the CCP virus panic, along with other countries making a push to implement a digital dollar currency where the government will have more direct control over the individual's finances and records, certainly doesn't make it any more delightful. In the famous words of Hillary Clinton,
never waste a good crisis.
Why though? Why draw the world into conflict in order for them to fulfill their sociopath agendas? World War I is famously known as, quote, the war to end all wars. As mentioned earlier in the PragerU video, we had as a result the Russian Revolution, the rise of Adolf Hitler, and the rejection of Wilson's 14 points or League of Nations. Germany pursued in World War II what it had originally pursued in World War I, world domination. When Germany lost the second time, a new government was restructured but divided between the West and the Soviet Union. Eventually, all of Germany was won over by the West, which would follow up with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Granted, we got additional help from China in boycotting goods from the Soviet Union, which is known as Russia today. We had gotten help from China because we were convinced that if we had involved China into the market, then they would promote free market and Western values. The complete opposite has proven to be true. It is obviously clear that their intent has been to establish communist rule, not just in its mainland, but also to reclaim Taiwan. Of course, it's looking like a military invasion of Taiwan, similar to Russia's annexation of Crimea from Ukraine. Both countries are teaming up together, making a push to conquer territories, expand their trading, lending, and security services, as well as breaking up the European Union or NATO. This is similar to their objectives back during the Cold War. They were also pushing heavily on their propaganda campaign against the West, with the leading pretense being the fault of the United States. So why act in such a manner that would lead to World War III? Plus, similar to our radical leftist friends, Russia and China also don't believe in letting a good crisis go to waste. To answer it simply, Russia and China have some unfinished business to take care of.
We always knew she'd be back, but what's she after?
She's come to finish the job.
Now we know the end state from all of this. We know what to expect later on when we combine political analysis with scriptural analysis. In a nutshell, I'm expecting these 4 entities to be drawn into worldwide conflict over the New World Order. The United States, either progressive values or conservative ones, the EU or NATO, the communist rule oversight by China, allied with Russia, Iran, and other rogue states, which can explain why they want to break apart the EU and the NATO, and the Islamic Caliphate. Now, if I weren't a believer in Christ as our Savior, I would be convinced that the communist rule would be successful over the United States, the EU and NATO, and the Islamic Caliphate. My reasoning for the United States is because if we adopt the idea that we need to establish a new world order, we open up the debate stage regarding which country and ideology is fit to be the head of the new world order. This is an issue the United States is not going to win among itself. Eventually, it will either succumb to communist influence, radical Islamic influence, and the incorporation into European countries regarding free trade and immigration. If the United States takes the stance in endorsing separate sovereignty, it will be much more united in its efforts to defeat evil throughout the world. Even if it did, though, in order for the United States to be successful in winning World War III, all generations have to be on the same page regarding the society of the United States. If we aren't, we are going to think that all our wars are pointless. Regarding the EU, I think it is going to succumb to communist Chinese influence. Regarding the outbreak of the CCP virus, it actually threatened the unity of the European Union. Countries were considering breaking apart the EU over differences into how each of their own countries should be ran. How does this play into China and Russia's hands? Before Ukraine became a member of NATO, Russia annexed Crimea with Ukraine, abstaining membership within NATO. If these countries break their unity, they are more susceptible to Russian and Chinese invasion. As for the Islamic Caliphate, I'm going to save this for the next video on the CCP virus. But before I leave, I'm going to answer a question I had brought up earlier. Who are these coastlands? It's possible they might be the European Union or NATO. Do these coastlands hold good or bad intent? Assuming the coastlands are either the EU or NATO, it's difficult to say what exactly their intent might be. Seeing how the coastlands are at war with the King of the North, they have also launched attacks in retaliation against the Antichrist regime, which his forces invade the King of the South. What was this in retaliation to, you might ask? Let's read these passages in full context.
The King of the North
will return to his own country with great wealth, but his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant. He will take action against it, and then return to his own country. At the appointed time, he will invade the south again, but this time the outcome will be different from what it was before. Ships from the western coastlands will oppose him. He will lose heart. Then he will turn back and vent his fury against the Holy Covenant. He will return and show favor to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. His armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. In retaliation to the attacks from the western coastlands, the Antichrist will vent his fury against the Holy Covenant. This is the Jewish temple, which has yet to have been built, but we will save that for another time. Taking into consideration the retaliatory attacks from the ambush conducted by the coastlands, it is possible that the ambush was actually a retaliatory attack in and of itself to the Antichrist taking, quote, action against the Holy Covenant and then return to his own country. It is also possible the coastlands were intent on forcing the Antichrist into a position of surrender. Little did they know it wasn't going to go down that way. To answer the question, do these coastlands hold good intent? It is highly possible. Maybe Judaism and Christianity are not going to be left for dead or hunted down in the end times, even for a post-tribber. I hope you enjoyed this video before I describe Islam's role in the end times and how the CCP virus is possibly going to expedite that role. I'm going to be doing a video of Nancy Pelosi. Sorry, I just can't help it. She's just too interesting of a character in politics to ignore. If you want to be caught up to speed, not only on her, but also the role of Islam in the apocalypse, but also further videos regarding these videos, one last time, be sure you click the subscribe button and the notification bell. So what are your thoughts on the CCP virus? What are your thoughts on the New World Order? Do you think other countries will kowtow to the Chinese government? Or will they give them the finger? What will the world look like 10 years from now? Will we be around for the end times? Do you think we are living in them right now? Share your thoughts, questions, and comments in the comment section.